The ashes still held warmth when she spoke. Catherine's voice cut through the desert silence like a blade finding bone, not pleading, not broken, but sharp with a hunger that made even the wind hold its breath. "They took my eyes," she said, and the Apache warrior standing over the charred remains of what had been her prison felt something ancient stir in his chest. Tahu had seen many kinds of darkness, but none like the hollow sockets that should have held starlight. The men who did this had stolen more than sight. They had taken the sacred light that belonged to the Creator. He looked at the ashes, then lifted his face to the mesa where shadows moved like ghosts. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper that somehow carried across miles of stone and sage, and from the silence his brothers answered. The desert morning held no mercy for the broken shelter that squatted like a wounded animal against the red rocks. Smoke still curled from the blackened timbers, lazy spirals that spoke of violence hours old, and the smell of burned wood mixed with something darker that made Tahu's jaw tighten as he approached on foot. His horse waited behind him, trained to silence, while he studied the scene with eyes that had learned to read stories written in ash and blood. The structure had been crude, white man's work, built fast and meant to hold something precious against its will. Now it was nothing but charcoal and regret, and somewhere in that ruin sat a woman whose voice had carried across the canyon like a prayer made of broken glass. She didn't look up when his shadow fell across her. Catherine sat with her back against a boulder that had probably stood there since the world was young. Her dress torn and stained with smoke, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for Sunday service, instead of sitting in the remains of her own hell. But it was her face that made Tahu's breath catch in his throat, not because of the bruises that painted her cheeks purple and yellow, not because of the dried blood that traced lines down from her temples, but because of the empty spaces where her eyes should have been. The sockets were clean, healed enough to tell him this hadn't happened yesterday or even last week, and the careful way she held her head told him she'd learned to navigate a world made of sound and touch and memory. "I heard you coming," she said without turning toward his voice, and there was something in her tone that reminded him of winter wind through dead leaves. "Apache, by the way you move. Light on your feet but deliberate, like you're used to hunting things that can hear you coming from a mile away." She tilted her head slightly, and he saw how she'd learned to use her remaining senses like weapons, gathering information from the whisper of leather against skin, the particular rhythm of his breathing, the way the desert air moved around his body. "You're not here to finish what they started, or you would have done it already. So either you're here to help or you're here to witness. Either way, I've got something to tell you." "Appa." Tahu crouched down slowly, his knees popping in the morning cold, and studied her face with the careful attention he usually reserved for tracking wounded animals through difficult terrain. There was steel in the set of her jaw, something that spoke of decisions made in darkness and promises carved into bone, and he recognized the look of someone who had stared into the abyss long enough to see it stare back. The men who had done this to her had thought they were taking her sight, but they'd given her something else instead. A clarity that came from having nothing left to lose, a purpose that burned brighter than the sun that would never touch her eyes again. "Tell me," he said, and his voice carried the weight of mountains, the promise of storms gathering on distant horizons. "They took my eyes," she said, and the words fell into the silence between them like stones dropped into a deep well. "Not because they had to, not because I fought them or tried to escape or gave them any reason, except that they could. They wanted to see what it looked like when hope died, wanted to watch the light go out and know they were the ones who turned off the lamp." Her hands tightened in her lap, knuckles white against the faded fabric of her dress, and Tahu could see the tremor that ran through her fingers like electricity seeking ground. "But they made a mistake. They thought taking my sight would make me helpless, would turn me into something they could keep forever, something that would never be able to identify them or find them or make them pay for what they'd done." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the rocks above them, a hawk cried out like it was announcing the arrival of something that had been a long time coming. Catherine lifted her face toward the sound, and Tahu saw how she'd learned to read the desert's moods through her skin, how she'd become part of the landscape in ways that sighted people never could. "I know their voices," she continued, and now there was something in her tone that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, something that spoke of vengeance as patient and inevitable as erosion. "I know the way they laugh, the way they breathe when they think they're safe, the way they say each other's names when they don't think anyone's listening. I know which one of them likes to whistle while he works, and which one always clears his throat before he speaks, and which one has a cough that sounds like gravel in a tin can." Tahu rose to his feet with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life moving through hostile territory, his eyes scanning the horizon while his mind processed what the white woman had told him. The desert stretched out before them like a vast canvas, painted in shades of red and gold, broken only by the dark shapes of mesas that rose from the earth like the bones of sleeping giants. And he knew that somewhere out there the men who had stolen this woman's sight were going about their lives as if they hadn't committed a crime that demanded blood for blood. The Apache way was older than the white man's law, older than their courts and their judges and their carefully written rules about what constituted justice, and it spoke of debts that could only be paid in the currency of consequence, of wrongs that could only be balanced by making the guilty understand the weight of their choices. He walked to the edge of the burned shelter, his moccasins silent on the ash-covered ground, and knelt to examine the tracks that told the story of what had happened here. Bootprints, deep and careless, spoke of men who hadn't bothered to hide their passage because they believed themselves beyond the reach of retribution, and the pattern of their movement told him they'd been confident, unhurried, taking their time with their work like craftsmen proud of their skill. But there were other signs too. Scuff marks where Catherine had been dragged, drops of blood that had dried to the color of rust, and the particular way the timbers had fallen that suggested the fire had been set deliberately, methodically, by someone who wanted to erase all evidence of what had transpired within these walls. "How many?" he asked, without turning around, and his voice carried across the morning air like the whisper of wind through canyon walls. Catherine didn't hesitate, didn't need to think about her answer, and he realized she'd been counting them in her mind every day since they'd taken her sight, cataloguing their voices and their habits and their weaknesses like a hunter studying prey. 4, she said, and there was something in the way she spoke the number that made it sound like a prayer and a curse wrapped together in the same breath. 4 men who thought they could take what they wanted and disappear into the desert like smoke. 4 men who believed that blindness would make me forget their faces, even though I never saw their faces to begin with. Tahu nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current of electricity that needed no words to complete its circuit. He had tracked men before, had followed their sign across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain, had learned to read their intentions in the way they made camp, and the care they took with their horses, and the routes they chose when they thought no one was watching. But this was different. This was personal in a way that went beyond the simple mechanics of pursuit and capture. Personal in a way that spoke to something deeper than the desire for justice, or the need to restore balance to a world that had been knocked off its axis by violence and cruelty. He turned back toward the mesa where he'd left his horse, but instead of walking in that direction, he cupped his hands around his mouth and released a sound that was part whistle, part bird call, part something that had no name in any language spoken by white men. The note hung in the air for a moment, pure and clear as mountain water, before it was swallowed by the vast silence of the desert. And then he waited with the patience of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed, could not be forced, could only be allowed to unfold in their own time, according to their own ancient rhythms. The answer came from 3 different directions at once, First from the rocks to the north, then from a stand of juniper trees to the east, then from somewhere high above them where the mesa's rim caught the morning light like the edge of a blade. The sounds were subtle, barely distinguishable from the natural music of the desert, but Tahu's trained ear caught each one and translated it into the language of brotherhood, of shared purpose, of men who had ridden together through fire and blood and emerged on the other side with their honor intact. His brothers were here, had been watching and waiting, and now they knew that the time for watching was over. Catherine tilted her head toward the sounds, her expression shifting from resignation to something that might have been hope, if hope could be forged from steel and tempered in the fires of righteous anger. "How many brothers do you have?" she asked, and Tahu smiled for the first time since he'd found her sitting in the ashes of her prison, a smile that held no warmth but carried the promise of storms gathering on distant horizons. "Enough," he said, and the word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of possibility spreading outward into the morning air, where 4 men who thought themselves safe were about to learn that some debts follow you, no matter how far you run. The 4 men had made camp in a box canyon 15 miles south, thinking distance and stone walls would keep their secrets buried with the ashes they'd left behind. They sat around their fire like kings dividing spoils, passing a bottle of stolen whiskey and laughing about the woman who'd screamed so prettily before they took her sight. The youngest one, barely 18 with peach fuzz on his chin, kept touching the silver locket he'd torn from Catherine's throat, turning it over in his palm like a prayer bead. The leader, a man named Crenshaw with tobacco-stained teeth and hands that had never known honest work, spat into the flames and watched them hiss. "She won't be telling no stories now," he said, and the others nodded like this was wisdom instead of the bleating of animals who'd forgotten they were still prey in someone else's hunting ground. But the desert has ears, and the wind carries more than dust. Tahu moved through the darkness above them like smoke given form, his brothers spread out along the canyon rim like stars in a constellation of judgment. They had tracked these men not by broken twigs or disturbed earth, but by the stench of their cruelty, a smell that clung to them like rotting meat, and made even the coyotes turn away in disgust. Below, the fire cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls, and in those shadows the Apache saw the truth written in light and darkness. These were not men, but parasites, feeding on pain and calling it pleasure. Tahu's hand found the knife at his belt, its bone handle worn smooth by his father's grip and his father's father before him. A blade that had tasted the blood of those who thought themselves beyond the reach of consequence. The youngest one stood to relieve himself against the canyon wall, whistling a tune his mother had sung to him before the world taught him that women were things to be broken. He never heard Tahu drop from the rocks above, never felt the hand that covered his mouth, never understood why the stars suddenly seemed so far away. When he didn't return, Crenshaw cursed and sent another man to find him, and that man walked into the darkness, calling his friend's name, like a prayer that would never be answered. The remaining 2 sat closer to the fire now, their laughter gone thin and brittle, their eyes darting to every shadow that moved beyond the circle of light. "Probably just taking a long piss," one of them said, but his voice cracked like a boy's, and his hand shook as he reached for the bottle. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap. Every sound became a threat. The pop of burning wood, the distant cry of a night bird, the whisper of wind through stone. Crenshaw's partner, a man called Dutch, who'd earned his name by cutting throats in Amsterdam before fleeing to this new world of endless sky and endless opportunity, stood with his rifle and peered into the darkness beyond their camp. "Something ain't right," he muttered, and Crenshaw laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "You're spooked by shadows, old man. Sit down and drink." But Dutch remained standing, his finger on the trigger, his eyes searching the rim of the canyon, where death waited patient as winter, watching them with the cold attention of a hawk circling wounded prey. Then the first arrow came, not to kill, but to announce, striking the ground between them with a sound like judgment being passed. Dutch spun toward the source, but saw only darkness, his rifle barrel sweeping back and forth like a blind man's cane. The second arrow took the bottle from Crenshaw's hand, shattering it against the rocks and sending whiskey cascading into the fire, which flared blue and hungry, casting their faces in the color of damnation. "Apache," Crenshaw whispered, and the word fell between them like a stone into deep water, sending ripples of terror spreading outward until it filled every corner of their small, shrinking world. They pressed their backs together now, rifles pointing in all directions, but you cannot aim at the wind, cannot shoot at the darkness that knows your name and has come calling with interest, compounded over years of unpaid debts. The canyon walls seemed to close around them like the fingers of a giant fist, and in the spaces between heartbeats they heard it, the sound of their own fear echoing back at them, multiplied and magnified until it became a chorus of reckoning that would follow them into whatever darkness waited beyond the dying light of their fire, where justice wore war paint and spoke in the language of consequences that could no longer be avoided or outrun. Dawn came like a blade across the canyon floor, cutting through shadows to reveal what the darkness had delivered. Crenshaw and Dutch sat bound with rawhide strips, their rifles scattered like broken promises around the cold ashes of their fire, their eyes wide with the terrible understanding that comes when predators realize they have become prey. Tahu stood before them with the patience of stone, his brothers arranged in a semicircle like judges in a court where mercy had been weighed and found wanting. The youngest one's locket lay at Crenshaw's feet, its silver surface catching the morning light and throwing it back like accusations, each gleam a reminder of the woman who would never see another sunrise because of what these men had chosen to become in the darkness of their own hearts. Catherine sat on a flat rock 20 feet away, her face turned toward the sound of their breathing, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust that only she could read. She had asked to be here for this moment, had insisted with a voice that brooked no argument, and Tahu had honored her request because he understood that some wounds could only heal when the one who caused them faced the consequence of their cruelty. "Tell me what you see," she said to Crenshaw, her voice carrying across the canyon like wind through broken glass. "Tell me about the colors, about the way the light hits the rocks, about all the things you stole from me when you decided my pain was worth less than your pleasure." Crenshaw tried to speak, but found his throat closed like a fist, his tongue thick with the taste of his own terror. Dutch began to weep then, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body like a tree in a storm, and his tears carved clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks as he babbled about his mother, about the farm he'd left behind, about the choices that had led him to this moment where the sun felt like judgment and every breath was borrowed time. "We didn't mean nothing by it," he whispered. But the words fell flat and lifeless in the morning air, lies so transparent that even he couldn't believe them. Tahu stepped closer, his shadow falling across the bound men like the wing of a great bird. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of mountains and the patience of rivers that carve canyons one grain of sand at a time. "You took her sight," he said simply. "Now you will understand what it means to live in darkness." The knife appeared in his hand, like it had been waiting there all along, its blade catching the light and holding it like a promise. Catherine tilted her head at the sound of steel singing against leather, and for the first time since they'd found her, something like peace settled across her features. "Not their eyes," she said quietly, her voice carrying a wisdom that came from walking through fire and emerging transformed. "Their hands. Take their hands, so they can never again reach for what doesn't belong to them, never again touch what they have no right to claim." Tahu nodded slowly, understanding flowing between them like water finding its level, and his brothers moved closer, their own blades appearing as if summoned by the morning light that revealed all secrets and made all debts come due. Crenshaw found his voice then, high and thin like a child's, begging and pleading and promising things he had no power to give, but his words scattered like leaves in the wind because some choices echo forward through time and cannot be called back no matter how desperately you wish them undone. The canyon walls threw his cries back at him, multiplying them until they became a symphony of consequence that would follow him into whatever life remained after this moment passed. Dutch had stopped weeping and sat silent now, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could see his own death approaching like a rider in the distance, inevitable and patient, and carrying justice in its saddlebags like provisions for a long journey. The sun climbed higher, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, and in that light, Catherine smiled for the first time since they'd taken her sight, because she could hear in the silence that followed Tahu's work the sound of balance being restored to a world that had tilted too far toward cruelty. When it was finished, when the screaming had faded, and the only sounds were the whisper of wind through stone and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead, she stood and walked toward the sound of Tahu's breathing, her hand extended like a bridge across the space between vengeance and peace. "Now," she said, her voice clear as mountain water, "now we can go home." And in those words lay the promise that some wounds, when properly tended, become the foundation for something stronger than what came before.